Hi, my name is Svitlana Biedarieva. I'm an editor of the book Contemporary Ukrainian and Baltic Art, Political and Social Perspectives, 1991-2021. I have invited for collaboration prominent curators and art historians from Baltic countries, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, and from Ukraine. And the purpose of the book was to make a parallel between the artistic processes and their development in the last 30 years after the gaining of independence by these countries. So the idea came from a comparative perspective, because I'm particularly interested in comparativism and art history, and I think is an art field that is currently underdeveloped but needs to be developed further, with the idea that every context in every local place can be comparable through a variety of different factors. And in the case of the Baltic countries and in Ukraine, of course, we can speak about such topics as memory, the trauma of totalitarianism, of the common Soviet past, but also about processes that were already after the fall of the Iron Curtain and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, that could be in a way compared through the lens of art and art history. The authors who I invited, they spoke of different types of media, contemporary media, and well, I think first I need to thank to the authors who participated and with their contributions. There are Eva Stachovska, who's the curator and the director of the Latvian Center of Contemporary Art, Margaret Tully, who is an art researcher and postdoctoral researcher at the Estonian Academy of Art, Vytautas Michelkevičius and Lina Michelkevičia, who are affiliated with the Vilnius University, and Vytautas was also the curator of pavilion of Biennale of Lithuanian Pavilion at Venice Biennale in the past year, and to Ukrainian curator Kateryna Botanova, who now works and lives in Switzerland, Olena Matrynyuk from Columbia University, who just opened a wonderful exhibition on perestroika and Ukrainian art, and to Jessica Zhychowycz, who is currently the Fulbright Ukraine director, and she published a wonderful book also on feminism in Ukrainian art. So with all this group of people, it was really needed to do some kind of multi-faceted perspective on processes, both in Baltic and Ukrainian art. So we spoke about video art, we spoke about such traditional genres painting as media art, performance, and how all these media manifested themselves in contemporary situation, and how they reflected on these topics that the authors speak about in their respective texts. First, Olena Matrynyuk, she speaks about perestroika art of late 80s and how there was this transfer to the early 90s, and she speaks predominantly in late 80s about painting, but then and their apocalyptic expectations, the premonition of the change, and that how this premonition already was manifested in the 90s with the explosion of different media that were alternative for the time, like performance, media art, video art. And then there is also the text of Kateryna Botanova, who speaks about artists as a virus who infects the system and makes the system change. And from the examples she proposes, precisely is seen how the media art and how all this new media starts entering into Ukrainian art practice precisely in the 90s. So I think this was the independence was the start for in art techniques and art particular kind of searches of the artists through these techniques. And in my text, I claim that there is a documentary turn in Ukrainian art of the last 8 years. And this is a topic that is already related to the newest political and social events in Ukraine, that with the protest of Maidan, with the war in the east of Ukraine with the annexation of Crimea. There was this big social kind of it produced some kind of confusion in how to understand the underlying reality, and this produced a lot of projects of Ukrainian artists that aim to document these traumatic events, but not just document, but also to interpret. So that's why it goes further than the documentary practice, but rather it already enters into this notion that I propose of documentary art. And we can speak about such filmmakers as Piotr Armenovsky, Maria Stoyanova, for example. We can speak about photographers as Yevgenia Bilorusets, as Yevgen Nikiforov. We can speak about a number of artists who either by film, photography, or work with the archives also, tried to, or interviews, direct interviews with participants and witnesses of the events in Donbas, aimed to create this niche of documentary art. In case of Ukrainian art, in case of art of the Baltics, of course, we can speak about quite different movement. But for example, Vytautas Michelkevičius, he researched on, and it was the first research made about media art in Lithuania. And also it intersected with this idea of recording and interpreting the reality through media. Well, initially we planned to make some kind of reflection on the last 30 years of independence. But when I started speaking with the authors from the Baltics, it revealed that actually it is impossible to make a break from this Soviet experience and go directly into independence experience. So if we speak about, for example, texts of Eva Stachowska and Margaret Tully, they refer to memories of the traumatic past. Margaret Tully speaks about the reflections of Second World War and the following conflicts in contemporary art of Estonia, and Eva Stachowska speaks about how were the transformations between the socialist, post-socialist society and their transfer to capitalist society, and how this is reflected in the art of Baltic artists. So we have this constant flashback to the past and the interpretation of the historical memory and the ways how this historical memory affects the identity and all these identity conflicts that can be found in the Baltics. For example, which is manifested in language conflicts, the presence of Russian community and their place, kind of that changed from the Soviet time towards the independence time, and so on. All these themes are very present in the contemporary Baltic art. For example, Eva Stachowska speaks about Estonian artist Kristina Norman, who presented at Venice Biennale the project in 2009, I think. She presented a project which is called After War, about the monument of bronze soldier. You know, this famous case of the bronze soldier, the monument in Tallinn, that was removed and moved to some cemetery from the center of the city. But part of Russian community and kind of like their supporters, they were against all this because they thought that it's kind of violating their right to memory. And the artist, she made casts from this figure, small casts, and she played them in the cemetery to observe what will happen with this replication of this memory, that kind of visualized memory. And she was surprised to see that some of these casts were moved to the center of the city, back to the center, and they got some kind of flowers and candles and all this kind of signs of support of and adoration of them by those people who were supporting this idea of the bronze soldier. So it reflects this kind of rupture in the society, and this rupture that still doesn't, this wound that still doesn't heal. And this is kind of some memory gap that still is present very strongly in Baltic conditions. Another project that Margaret Tully proposes is by the Estonian artist Anastasia Sosunova, and is a project about an experimental kind of biological experiment that existed in reality, which was called Demnikov dog. It's a dog with two heads that lived for a while, but not for long. And she makes this kind of as a central notion to comparison of creation of this nation state in Estonia, of this kind of Estonian identity, of this conflict that also is present within the society. That is kind of the silent conflict that many of with the, for example, informational war from the side of Russia towards Ukraine and towards European countries, it kind of became more present in the society, and so on. We can speak about different projects that focus on female destinies in the Soviet and post-Soviet situation. We can speak about different projects that discuss memory through identity and identity through memory. And in this way, I see that Baltic art is actually more direct and in a way kind of more articulated politically and more kind of, let's say, polemic than Ukrainian art, because Ukrainian art usually tends to, if not to omit these topics, but kind of to approach them from a very different form, especially considering that the situation, the political situation in Ukraine is much more heated than in the Baltics. I can speak about, for example, the project that is more oriented to documentary approach is the project on dehumanization by Yevgen Nikiforov, who traveled across the territory of Ukraine from 2015 to 2018 after the dehumanization laws were accepted, and these monuments to Soviet leaders and related to the Soviet past, they started being removed or defaced or kind of reworked in some way, and he was documenting this process, and he presented it as a series of photographs. So basically, it's the documentary project of photographs that consists of photographs of the sculptures, but it calls for this discussion on the kind of whether there is a way to preserve a historical heritage. What can we call historical heritage, first of all? Is this heritage of totalitarianism, or it is historical heritage that is relevant for the contemporaneity as well? And he actually addresses critically these both points of view and presents it through this photographic project. But I must say that Ukrainian art, as I see it, is more rooted in kind of in contemporaneity. Well, for me, it was very interesting to read the text by Olena Matrynyuk about the artistic life of Kiev of late 80s, because I was not that well acquainted with the topic, and for me it was very interesting that there was a big diversity actually. After Perestroika already started, a number of art squads appeared in Kiev, like the Parisian Commune and Kiev Art Squad, and different very alternative and very countercultural initiatives that further formed the art scene of Kiev in the 1990s, and subsequently also they formed the art scene of kind of Ukrainian art scene through different points of reference. And the place of painting was very prominent in that case, because we can speak about the works by Arsen Savadov, the works of Galassi, and many other artists who worked in the medium of painting, but they formed this transformation, conceptual transformation, that followed in the subsequent decade. If we speak about Ukrainian art, and if we speak about Ukrainian art of now, in particular, I think most of it is focused on different aspects of explorations of identity. For example, we find many examples of feminist art and Jessica Zhychowycz writes brilliantly about this topic, how these transformations from the traditional society towards the kind of postmodernist society and something that follows the postmodernism now, how it was manifested in the reassessment of the female figure in art projects. And from the other side, of course, when we speak about Ukrainian art, is impossible to kind of not to speak about the project that touch upon national identity, and they also touch upon some kind of linguistic sensitivities sometimes, and all of this are present in and articulated precisely after 2014. It is impossible to figure out a direct line, and also it as well it is impossible to figure out direct parallels between kind of comparative aspects of between Ukraine and the Baltics. All of this needs to be done through kind of notions, and these selected notions would be memory, conflict, and identity. And in the case of development of, for example, Ukrainian art since the 1990s towards 2020s, of course, there is a much bigger presence and a shift, kind of paradigmatic shift from traditional media towards more kind of contemporary new media. And in this new media, we can include both those visual and audiovisual based media, like video art and media art, but also we can include such media as installation, performance, which is unfortunately is not reflected in particular case of Ukraine, and this is a significant difference with the Baltics, is not reflected in the education. That educational system of art is not suited for these practices. That traditional Ukrainian academia of art doesn't provide basically training for these artists, and those artists who emerge in Ukraine, they in many cases they didn't study even at the Academy of Art, because they looked for their ways through different other professions, such as filmmakers, film directors, or even engineers, and that's how they come to the understanding of these creative processes. And this is a very different situation from the Baltics, because in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, let's say the institutional structure that supports contemporary art is much more developed, and the educational system is more integrated and more in dialogue with this system of contemporary art. In Ukraine is like the sporadic individual projects that appear and they create this creative field, but they are not integrated into any system. I communicated with the authors, and my personal interest, apart from research interest, was that I lived actually for some years in Estonia in 2009, 2011, and I was quite impressed by local art scene. And that's why it was kind of a long-term aim even to write something about Estonian art and of course about the rest of Baltic art, because they persist in permanent exchange and is kind of as a group of artistic kind of positions inside of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. They're very interesting, even in this exchange between them. And in the case of it was the case of authors, of course. They were in touch with the artists, and it's impossible to do a work on contemporary art history, I think, without being in permanent dialogue with the artists. For example, I talked really a lot for my text with Andrij Bojarov, who is a photographer, and he was telling me very interesting things about his projects that he presented in Kiev, in Lviv, also in Poland, and big part of these conversations that actually influenced the way I interpreted his projects in my text. And he had this wonderful project where he presented works of forgotten photographers of Polish origin who lived in pre-war Lviv. And he gathered these works, and by reconceptualizing them, by reappropriating them, he placed them into the discourse of contemporaneity, of contemporary art. I think it's a very interesting experiment that is on the edge between archival research and artistic practice. Well, I already mentioned the one work by Andrij Bojarov, the project which is called Copy Past. Is a project where he reappropriated the photographs of pre-war Polish photographers in Lviv and he presented them in a kind of recontextualized way. Another work I would like to highlight is by Andrii Dostliev. Is called Occupation, and the artist worked with the archive of his family, but the imaginary archive, because the archive was lost when he needed to flee his home in Donetsk region, and all the photos of his family were lost. And being already in residence in Poland, he started recreating this archive by purchasing the photographs of other people from Poland, from also it included some of Baltic countries, and he was searching for them on the flea markets, and then recombining them in a collage in a way that they would be reminiscent of his family own archives. Imagining that this figure could be his uncle, this figure could be his grandmother, and so on. And I think this is quite an interesting project in the terms how actually personal memory can be reconsidered as public memory. And moreover, it can be reconsidered as transnational memory, because these photos can be found as kind of similar in different in different regions and in different countries. Another project is a project by Arsen Savadov, which is called Donbas-Chocolate, and this project was mentioned by many authors, in particular by Kateryna Botanova and by Olena Matrynyuk, how in its time in 1997, the staged photos of miners wearing ballet outfits actually challenged a whole number of identities, between political identity, making this reference to all this Swan Lake that was appearing in the early 90s on TV in the times of major crisis, between gender identity and the identity also of such an industrial region as Donbas. And this project actually is a kind of a starting point for many of the projects dedicated to the area, and especially those actualized by the war in the East, that contemporary artists work at this moment also. For example, we can speak about a project by Yevgenia Bilorusets, which is a photography project. In 2014, she traveled to the borderline, to the front line, basically, and she documented the life of women, of female miners, in a small town on the borderline with where all these conflictive events, all the war events were going on, and by documenting their routine life and the most intimate moments of their life, also she made a social comment on how much does the conflict, does the war and the danger provided by the war affect the life of these women, because the working condition in which they live in and in which they work in and their living conditions, they are already affected by some kind of economic depression and by kind of this idea of existing on the margin of the war. Well, as other projects, the thing is that as many of these projects were not described by me, but by the authors. I think it would be much more interesting if they would talk about them. But I've also would like the project of Vytautas Michelkevičius for the Biennale in Venice, where they represented a project which was called Behind the White Curtain, and they collected the whole group of artists who were awarded by the main national award of Lithuania for their work in plastic arts. And they gathered all these works and brought them to Biennale. But these works were not on show. They were taken out by request from the audience. There was a catalog, and someone from the audience could select one work from the catalog. And then there was a group of people who were taking this work out, showing it, and then hiding it back to the storage. So this also commented on the state policy of Lithuania that actually highlights its own artists, awards its own artists, but then doesn't really have a longitude strategy of work with their own artists. And I think this project is kind of, in its critical stance, also intersects with many of Ukrainian points of view on this topic, of the government or of all this kind of national strategy about fine art, contemporary art that is not kind of virtually present. And that's why it can be developed through some kind of private projects, such as, for example, the publication of this book. Michelkevičius and Lena Michelkevičius, they focused on the topic of collecting, how actually art is collected and gathered and kind of classified and interpreted in contemporary by contemporary, mostly private collectors, and the artist who appears collector. So in this case precisely, he spoke about this project of Behind the White Curtain, about the governmental policy of collecting art and working with this art. That is very kind of sporadic, but also he spoke about a number of artistic projects that were reflecting on this. For example, he spoke about the project of Juozas Laivis, which was called a cemetery of art. And he proposed to all the artists who were not satisfied with their work actually to go and to bury it. And in this way, he created some kind of an anti-archive of the work that once existed, but then they were buried by the will of their own authors. And so some kind of all of this critical projects that are called to reflect on ways of collecting. And also it relates, of course, to quite difficult questions that I think in Ukrainian art is also present, is the absence of kind of solid art market that would be linked to the solid system, institutional, of both private and public institutions. Not just public, but also private institutions, like galleries which would exhibit art. So in this case, the project by Laivis of the Cemetery of Artworks also reflected on this idea that there are in Lithuania, there are not enough private galleries, for example, to collaborate with and to create this healthy and sustainable art market. I would be happy to publish a second volume of Ukrainian and Baltic art, because I think this is an enormous theme that needs to be uncovered and needs to be discussed, because this kind of comparative way of speaking about common past and discrepancies and the kind of independent development in Baltic and Ukraine really is not that common to speak about it. But in my case, I am a historian of Eastern European art and Latin American art, and that's why I'm in Mexico. Yeah, and I'm particularly now interested to look at some Latin American aspects and to develop some kind of comparativism based on this. I've done already some work on this back in 2019 when I co-curated an exhibition here in Mexico City, which was called At the Front Line, Ukrainian Art 2013-2019, and we presented a selection of Ukrainian art focused on the events of Maidan, on war and the annexation of Crimea, to Mexican public. We presented here at the National Museum of Cultures. And this was quite a successful project because it was aiming to create some kind of public discussion on the topic. And we found that the main points of intersection actually were kind of the trigger for the discussion was the topics of violence and the topics of displacement. That here people in Mexico, they experience, for example, the violence, the drug-related violence in the north, or for example, all these displacements related to this topic, even though, of course, in the center of Mexico is not present, but there are kind of reminiscences also with the situation with the conflict in Ukraine, like the echo that arrives from the borderline to the center. And this was a very interesting experience that actually pushed me further to explore, and it resulted in this volume because among those works in that exhibition, there was one work by Kristina Norman where she filmed Ukrainian artist Alevtina Kakhidze talking about the events of Maidan. But Kakhidze, it was kind of a subversive project because Kakhidze was talking about events of Maidan, like given an imaginary guided tour around Maidan in the Palace Square in St. Petersburg in front of Hermitage. It was during Manifesta in 2015. So she was pretending that actually Palace Square was all this column in the middle and everything. It was Maidan. And this project was, of course, seen as very subversive by those people in Hermitage, but also it gave this idea of the intersectionality of possible histories and how kind of places with different landmarks, they can intersect conceptually, and how we can, even though it is imaginary, but we can transport these political notions between them. And so beautiful collaboration between Estonian and Ukrainian artists. And that's how, from that exhibition, it arrived to this volume. And I think that the next book needs to engage more precisely with Latin American connotations and political experiences, because different Latin American countries, they have beautiful also and quite scary stories of related to totalitarian regimes and to all this historical trauma, and to link it somehow maybe to Ukrainian art or to more widely to some examples of Eastern European art between post-Soviet countries and the Soviet bloc.